how Mother Mary was born divinely by her mother and how all of this time she was being groomed to become a divine birth priestess. And I'm able to explain for thinking people how this virgin birth actually could have happened. Through intentionality and working with the interdimensional realms and working with the power of the womb, bring forth a higher dimensional being. But for those who really want to bring forth a super duper high dimensional being, that's where virgin birth comes in. And the reason it is done is to help humanity continue to evolve and to raise humanity back up when it has been for a long time under the yoke of negative forces. So periodically, we need a kind of an upgrade from a walking avatar, a walking high dimensional being, to model for us what it is for us to return to our own divine human blueprint, which is actually encoded in our DNA. So these beings will periodically walk the earth to remind us and serve as a model. And then because of all the negativity, their message will get all corrupted and hijacked and taken over. And before you know it, the religion is doing the opposite of what it was supposed to do to begin with, killing people in the name of whatever. So that is the reason to bring forth an avatar. And it takes a very high level of practice on the part of the priestess. She has to be working on this her whole life and even have come into this lifetime from previous lives where she was working it. And Sri Kaleshwar says that Mother Mary had millions of lifetimes in order to perfect her soul so that she could come in and conceive one in a divine fashion, such as Jesus.
Welcome to the Awakening Entrepreneur podcast. This show is for entrepreneurs that have chosen to define their life beyond the material. They have followed their soul on a hero's journey towards the mystery of the spiritual. I'm your host, Garrett Ng. Each episode will be learning from awakened entrepreneurs and spiritual thought leaders. They have broken through the mold of being ordinary to extraordinary, challenging our paradigm, shining lights to the dark, giving hope when there is doubt. The moment of truth is upon us. It is time to transcend our world from fear to love. Are you ready? Let's go! Today, I got a very special guest on the Awakening Entrepreneur podcast. And we're going to explore some of the things that I've been led to learn about. So I've shared with some of you guys, I started getting onto Dolores Cannon's work, and then I stumbled across another book that talks about the Sophia Code. And amongst all that, one of the characters or one of the avatar that I admire quite a bit and have more interest in learning is Mother Mary Magdalene. Even though I was raised as a Catholic, maybe I fell asleep a lot of my religious classes and going to mass in the morning. So I didn't pay much attention on what the Bible actually says and the stories. But this person, her name is Marguerite Mary Rigoglioso. She's a Ph.D, is the foremost authority on the history of the virgin birth and has taught graduate, undergraduate courses in the US, the United Kingdom. She's the director of her own esoteric school, Seven Sister Mystery School, dedicated to restoring knowledge about the sacred feminine and to empower people on their non-traditional spiritual journeys as well. And on her website, even though it's for empowering the sacred feminine, there's also a section about men. And I ended up downloading some audio meditation that she did with men, and I booked a session with her. So I look forward to that as well. She is the author of The Cult of Divine Birth in Ancient Greece and Virgin Mother, Goddess of Antiquity. And her most recent book is The Mystery Traditions of Miraculous Conception, Mary and the Lineage of Virgin Birth, which is a major influence of our conversation today. So welcome, Margaret.
Thank you so much, Gary. I really appreciate being here.
Wow. So I guess before we get into how do you became such a resource and dedicate a lot of your time and focus in writing a book and exploring Mary Magdalene, I want to learn more about like, I guess, your journey of awakening and you growing up in your childhood. Was life like prior to the awakening journey as well?
Yes, yes. Well, also just to clarify, there's Mother Mary and Mary Magdalene, as we know. So I have taught quite a bit on Mary Magdalene in academic settings for years, as well as through my school, Seven Sisters Mystery School. This particular book, The Mystery Tradition of Miraculous Conception, is subtitled Mary and the Lineage of Virgin Births. So this one is really about Mother Mary, and it's unveiling, opening a door about a whole new way of looking at the claims of Mother Mary.
Thank you so much
Was
for
able to conceive a child through miraculous means, right?
thank you for
So,
clarifying that, because I guess part of my confusion at the time and still from my intro is like there's Mother Mary and Mary Magdalene, which is together with Jesus. And in the Bible, there's a lot of Joseph as well. So sometimes that even our audience may get confused with the different characters. So thank you for clarifying that.
yeah, because there are several women named Mary in the New Testament, and they're all circling around Jesus. And part of that is what I determined through my research is because the name Mary was originally a priestess title. It wasn't even a proper name. It was a descriptor of a type of woman, a holy woman, right? So that's why in the Hebrew, it would have been Mariam, but all the way going back to the Hebrew tradition, I think that this name actually comes from the Egyptian Mary, which connected with the goddess Isis, and it was a term that referred to divine love. So really all of these priests, these women were holy women related to divine love, and Mother Mary was one of those, as was Mary Magdalene. So hence the link for them all.
Wow,
But you
thank
wanted
you.
to talk about how I got started on my spiritual path? Well, like many people, I think I got started before this lifetime, in many, many previous lifetimes where I've been on a path. I've had various roles, male, female, whatever, being on the side of the light, on the side of the negative, and so forth. And so when I entered into this lifetime, I believed that I chose and understood that I would go through some trials as part of what I would have to break through in order to get to another spiritual level. And so those trials involved having a mother who was ill when I was a child, and she died when I was 10 years old. So I automatically had the descent into the underworld and the initiation into the death realms, which is really the initiation into the realms of spirit, because it brings you smack up against these massive philosophical questions. What is the soul? Where does the soul go when the person dies? What if anything is on the other side, right? So that was a question that I pondered. And then with all of the additional traumas that I experienced in my childhood, by the time I was in my 20s, I was really quite, wounded and in need of spiritual assistance, emotional, psychological assistance, and so forth. And I started discovering various things. I did go back to the Christianity of my childhood, but I got involved in a cult, so because there can be cult-like groups that use Christianity as their basis, but they still have all of the characteristics of a cult. And that is something that I briefly got involved in. And luckily I was able to get out of it. But once I started to see my way clearly, what I really started opening to was the notion of the sacred feminine and goddesses, and the fact that all around the world, goddesses have been venerated. And even in Europe in ancient times, the pre-Christian tradition was based in veneration of sacred female figures. And as I started finding out about this on the archaeological and historical levels, my mind exploded. And then I started connecting with the phenomenon of channeling, people who are able to open to communications from the spirit realm and deliver high-level information. And who knew that eventually someday I was going to become what I call an oracle. I don't channel beings. I don't let anything inhabit my body. I go into whatever the deep state is, theta, whatever, and I open up my consciousness and I connect with my higher self or my goddess self, and I receive higher level information that way. So from the time I was in my, mid to late 20s on, I was really on this non-traditional esoteric spiritual path. And I very much enjoyed an organization in the Cambridge and Boston, Massachusetts area at the time called the Interface Foundation, which had a lot of mind, body, spirit classes and weekend workshops. And a lot of the people who were on the so-called New Age spiritual circuit would go there and speak. People who would also go to places like the Omega Institute and Esalen and Kripalu Yoga Institute and so forth. So that was one of those nodes at the time. It's now not in existence anymore. But I would go and I would be like a kid in a candy store eating all of that stuff up, reading books nonstop about the goddess. And I discovered the work of Maria Gimbutas, who was this archaeologist who was the one who basically showed that ancient Europe was focused on goddess veneration. And I wanted to follow in her footsteps and become an archaeologist and continue the work. But there wasn't a lot of support for that in academia, in archaeology. So eventually, I went to a women's spirituality program that came out of the Interface Foundation, but it then became its own thing. And this was a goddess spirituality program. And so I went through it to my heart's content over 3 years, a lot of experiential exercises, a lot of learning, a lot of reading. And by the end of it, I knew that I wanted to go to graduate school, but with a spiritual bent. And because I couldn't find any support in archaeology schools to follow in the footsteps of Maria Gimbutas, I decided to go to the Women's Spirituality Master's and Ph.D. program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. So my spiritual life segued into my academic spiritual life, where I was always weaving the two, the spirituality, the intellect, and the intuition, the spirituality and the academic. And I had a real tremendous experience at the California Institute of Integral Studies, getting my master's and PhD, being the academic while also going through learning about and experiencing sacred medicines, doing group ceremonial work, meeting all sorts of esoteric people who really were open to the other dimensions of reality. So then, from there, I really went more and more deeply into this work. And I continued to be an academic teacher. But eventually in 2012, I decided I was able to receive support to start my own esoteric school. And that's when I really took the turn to have very esoteric material that nobody was going to control or censor in any regard. And I was combining that with esoteric teachings for people to have experiences of being able to access open dimensions, develop their psychic skills, develop their oracle or channeling abilities, and so forth. And so I've had Seven Sisters Mystery School. We turn 9 on September 14th, 2021. So that's coming up as of this recording. And I've taught many, many classes over those years, and I've seen and worked with hundreds of clients in thousands of sessions, giving them intuitional readings. And I've been interviewed for podcasts and films and, all sorts of other things. I've got these 3 books that you mentioned. And in a nutshell, how I got to where I am today and what my spiritual path has been. And along the way, of course, I had the opening to Mother Mary as a sacred feminine goddess figure. I was able, by moving into the goddess movement, I was able to see Mother Mary in a whole new light. And I had one mentor teacher who helped me see that, Charlene Spretnak. And then I really began working with some of my colleagues in California, where I lived for 20 years. And, Diana Melchizedek was one of my sister colleagues who helped me really understand Mother Mary as an active mentor. That and various other things put me in connection with her on a very personal level. And so I've been able to do my academic research about her, but also work with her on the spiritual plane.
Thank you for sharing that. I've got 3 kids, and I was fascinating listening to your story because you just gave us like a 5-minute snippet, but within that, I can taste the journey is so enriching. And that was just a small overview. If you were to share with your 9 years old self or any other kids around the same age, what is life about beyond the physical world? How would you explain it to them?
Well, I would say, where do you think we come from when we're born? And where do you think we go after we leave the earth plane? If we just even start going, about that, that will start leading us into the realm of the divine and God and the soul. So I would, start from that perspective. And then I would say, you may not be aware of it, but there are many dimensions of reality beyond this one. And we access some of them, like when we have dreams at night, we're in a different mode, we're in a different level. But there's a lot going on beyond the five senses. And that has to do with some people call extrasensory perception, and what some people talk about extraterrestrial beings and so forth. And once we start getting on that road, it becomes very, very interesting if you're curious about it. That's how I might start it out.
Mm, that's really interesting. If let's just say still on the same path, if a child comes across like challenges, hurdles that upset them, and they may blame it on the external person or the external situation, how would you approach them in helping them see from a higher perspective?
Well, I think first of all, with children, the most important thing is to, and I have not had children, but I'm just partly going by the young people in my life, the young person I've been, first of all, important to just give them lots of love and validate their hurt and their wounding and help them feel empowered in and of themselves. Like, how can they take this situation and turn it around? What do they need to feel more powerful in this situation? What kind of boundaries do they need to set toward those who have hurt them? That kind of thing. Number one, to take care of the child's emotional and physical needs. And then once those levels are more handled, or, do they need outside protections? Are there authorities that need to come in? Whatever it is. Once we start talking about how this young person can become empowered, then we can talk about helping them to look at what's going on from a different perspective. Like, what could be motivating this other person to behave with you in this way? Can we see what they're going through as reflective of their own pain and their own trauma? It depends on how open and curious the child is, because if they really take to that, I might get into the whole conversation of, well, do you know about the concept of karma? And that there's a strong possibility that nothing that happens to us is accidental. And none of the people we meet are accidental. And none of the situations we're in are accidental. But in fact, they're part of what we came in this lifetime to learn. So even though you might be learning a lot of challenging things, there's some level in which your soul came into this life knowing you were going to have challenges. You actually chose your parents, believe it or not. And you chose those challenges because you knew that getting through them and learning how to emotionally heal yourself and cope and find out about the bigger spirit behind everything was going to get you to the next level of your soul's evolution.
I love it.
How's that?
I
You
think
can rewind, excerpt, and play these for your children and see how they respond.
yeah, I think the key takeaway for me is that number one, you acknowledge the feeling, which is, I guess, a lot of our upbringing. You shouldn't be upset, you shouldn't cry, you shouldn't like have all these emotions, but then the emotion become trapped. So what you're suggesting is like acknowledge that the feelings is okay and just feel it. And the second part, you uses a lot of question. You almost like you see it as an opportunity for them to using the challenging situation as a catalyst for them to transcend, for them to awaken. And each one of these challenges, another great opportunity for them to transcend.
That's right. For them to go deeper, transcend, expand their understanding of the world and get closer to the divine spirit.
So your esoteric school is called Seven Sisters Mystery School. Why Seven Sisters?
Well, a number of years ago, 15 or more years ago, when I was at the California Institute of Integral Studies, I started learning about the Pleiades. And they are a star system that I found out later was very important in the ancient world, not only to the ancient Greeks, but the Egyptians and many other cultures around the world. There are many cultures that have star lore related to the Pleiades and what they represent. And initially, how I learned about them was through people claiming to channel the Pleiades. And I would go and listen to these channelings, and this just seemed so remarkable to me, everything that was being said. And so I became more curious about who these Pleiades were. And at one point, this channeler said, I had started to research them, and I started to understand that in the Greek tradition and many others around the world, they were considered seven sisters. And in fact, they were considered seven seed mothers of humanity. So it's their DNA that went into the larger part of the human race. And so we can all be traced back to these seven women who were sisters. And in fact, it turns out that story is validated by Brian Sykes, for example, and other geneticists who say we all go back to seven mothers. And Brian Sykes said, and they were related. Okay. Then through my work researching divine birth as an actual conception practice that priestesses could do at very high levels, I came to learn that at one of the oracle centers where I believe this was being done, the priestesses were called Pleiades, or doves. That is the meaning of the word Pleiades. It means doves in ancient Greece. And these women who took that title on, like the Marys took on the title of love, these priestesses took on the title of dove or Pleiades. And they were both oracles. They were able to conceive and give divine wisdom streams to others. And they were divine birth priestesses, so they could conceive. And there seems to be evidence that the seven sisters of the Pleiades were able to conceive children through non-ordinary means. And that's how their lineage went through the whole entire human race. So because of all of these things related to the Pleiades, and it was so much what I was being called to research in this lifetime, the oracle abilities of women, and to help myself and others develop that. And also the divine conception processes of women, which I've written about in my 3 books. I feel that the Pleiades have always been with me and that I have some kind of connection with them. And then it turns out that one day, I don't know how many years ago, I was still living in California, San Francisco Bay Area, and I did a ceremony with medicine out in the woods. And as I was walking back, I received the message, well, you are a Pleiadian ambassador. And I was like, what? Are you kidding? And they're like, well, yeah, you're going to have to tell people that. And I'm like, I'm not going to tell people I'm a Pleiadian ambassador. And then all of a sudden I'm telling people that I'm a Pleiadian ambassador. And as it turns out, there's another woman named Christine Day who also calls herself a Pleiadian ambassador, so I was getting this information and she's doing that work as well. And there are others who consider themselves Pleiadian ambassadors. So I came to realize that I don't know that I'm, quote, from the Pleiades, but I have had pass-throughs or lifetimes there. And for whatever karmic reasons, I've agreed to be an ambassador of their information onto the planet, which mainly has to do with women's womb power, women's conception power, women's ability to give oracles, all of this, which needs to be resurrected, and divine love, and unity consciousness, which is what the Pleiades are all about, as I understand them. Unity in diversity, diversity in unity. So that's basically, in a nutshell, everything that I've been about. And it's true to my mission as a Pleiadian ambassador, among many other things, most likely. So when it came time to naming my school, I didn't even know all of this stuff at that time. I knew some of it, But I just was in the shower and I was thinking, okay, I knew that I was going to start an academy. I didn't know if I was going to call it an academy, an institute, a school. I then settled on that I wanted to call it a mystery school. Okay. And what came to me in the shower was Seven Sisters Mystery School. I never questioned it. I never looked back. And then it turns out that after that, there were all these mystery schools that started popping up. Not that I was the first, there were a few around that I had been aware of, but it became one of these fast growing esoteric phenomena for people to found and name and run mystery schools.
So who would you say your school is tailored for?
I would say it's tailored for people who are awakening to the subtle dimensions of reality, the alternative dimensions, the world within the worlds, who understand divinity as a multiplicity that has masculine and feminine. And those who are having these awakenings, these kinds of spiritual awakenings that you were mentioning when we were off camera at the beginning, where you suddenly have what feels like a major spiritual awakening. Some people call it a Kundalini awakening or whatever. And suddenly you're awake and aware to all of these kinds of realities that you weren't before. You want to go deeply into your own healing. You understand the reality of interdimensional beings. You maybe want to do everything that you can to learn about this. So it's these people. A lot of my clients have been women, but there are men as well, and males who just appreciate and either take classes or are subscribed to my newsletter. And at this point, I would say it's people who are going through what I call ascension. Some people call it ascension, but to me, it's not about moving up and out, but it's moving deeper inward and carrying your understandings into the body, bringing your body into fifth dimensional consciousness beyond just the 3 dimensions that we're told and beyond just the 5 senses. And even more than that now, going into what people are calling the new earth. And this has to do with an alternative understanding to the mainstream narrative that's going on regarding every level of life and reality, from the medical to the political to what needs to happen and what doesn't need to happen. So it's a very tumultuous, shaky time now, like never before. Because those of us who have been on the new earth path, we're kind of able to do it in the background. But now we're having to be exposed front and center with our beliefs about how to even handle these various medical crises. And you can see the dividing lines in what people decide to do and not to do, and what they believe and what they don't believe about what's happening. There are people who are moving into the new earth and they have a kind of common understanding and therefore common ways of what we feel are the solutions and what should and shouldn't be done. And then you have the other people who are kind of going into the whole world of accepting everything that's being told, getting things in their body that may be kind of further taking them away from various realms of spiritual understanding, etc. So it's a very intense and tense time right now where all this bifurcation is happening.
Marguerite, I really like the energy that you share, what you just shared, even more than the content. Because when you share it, you have this certainty about it from both your intuition or your connection to your higher self, as well as your academia research that backs it up. So if those 2 things combined, it's like, this is a matter of fact. And this is not just overnight. You've done this for so many years. It's like, this is your whole life. You've been exposed to all this evidence and all this truth about other ways on seeing how this world actually works.
Yes, and I've had the experience of opening to other dimensional states of consciousness through using various sacred medicines at times. Although at this point, I have minimal use of those medicines, and I'm more and more open all the time. And I also practice these skills and use these states quite a bit every day of the week. So I feel that I see and know and penetrate more and more into these understandings. And it's what's real for me. It's what's real for a lot of people.
Well, on that topic, what do you see the role of plant medicine in one's journey? From what you described, it sounds like for a lot of people that I've talked to going through this journey, is a common path that the plant journey may help them almost like kickstart the process into seeing and sensing different things that, well, yeah, it's just, especially you could be doing many years of meditation and still, hey, like it's nice, it's calm, but it's not like transporting to other dimensions. But then the more you do it, the less that you feel the need to continue with the sacred medicine. It's almost like the portals, the gates are already open. So how do you see the role of sacred medicine in helping one's journey?
Yes, well, it's tricky because you have to proceed with it carefully through the right context, the right setting, ideally the right mentors, because it is strong. It can open you to the illumination, but it can also open you to the whole realm of the negative. And sometimes you can get hitchhikers coming into your space and not know it, even for many years. And also, this is a realm where too can be infiltrated, in certain ways by certain beings or certain thought forms. So you have to proceed with a lot of caution and care. I don't recommend people willy-nilly go off and do even cannabis, or certainly not the stronger ones like ayahuasca tea or mushrooms, because you can be quite opened and even blown open, and you really benefit from a teacher, okay, and also to set protective space and so forth. One of the more gentle plant medicines but effective is cacao. So that generally will open the heart and the consciousness without bringing some of the other challenges that can come with the stronger substances. But all of those caveats said, when used in the most positive way, yes, these plant medicines and combinations can truly open one's eyes, opens one's third eye to what's on the other side of the veil. And you can have a feeling of strong knowing how real these other dimensions are, and you can begin exploring them as what we might call a cosmonaut, right? So I'm grateful for those openings that I had, even as treacherous in some ways as they were, even with cannabis, because, I got into trouble and had to have some clearings and so forth as a result of what had come into my space from the cannabis. But it did open me like ordinary meditation at the time was not going to do. And mushrooms was too far even beyond what I could do. And I've never even done ayahuasca. It would just be too much for me, because I was already a sensitive person. So it also depends for people on how thick their dimensionality is. Some people, they're very thickly in third dimension, won't even have very much of an esoteric experience. Or visions, or they won't go into the depths of understandings and the halls of mysteries that I and others have gone through. While as some on very little will really open. And I think, Gary, it has to do with a combination of your karma, your previous relationship with medicines and the other realms, your destiny lines, and where you are in your spiritual growth, how open you already are. And all of those things will determine really what kind of experience you have with medicine, as well as who are your teachers. Are they setting a protective space that truly is allowing for the portal to open, etc.?
Oh, wow. Love it. So can you tell me about your latest book and I guess how you got called to write it, and I guess the content of what the book is about?
Yes, right. So again, we're talking here about the mystery tradition of miraculous conception, Mary, and the lineage of virgin births. So right away, that's telling us that there is a practice of miraculous conception, that there was a lineage of it, that more than one lineage. Mary was in one of them, but there are multiple virgin births that have happened all over the planet, essentially. And so how I start the book is by summarizing the research from my previous two books, mainly about divine birth as I discovered it in ancient Greece, as an actual practice of priestesses. a
So the
technology.
divine birth, virgin birth, as in like there's a woman, there's no intercourse, and then she becomes pregnant. Is that correct?
Right. Which is
Wow.
called also parthenogenesis in scientific terms. So she is able to combine herself into male and female and spontaneously start the egg dividing through deep, deep spiritual means within her. And then what I discovered, though, is there were other later versions of miraculous conception that did start involving the woman in conjunction with male beings on the other side of the veil. And then with human males who were incorporating these beings. And so there was a sort of a trajectory of what happened with this divine birth technology, as in some senses went through a devolution. It devolved. But then again, there is that very high level male female unification that is high Tantra, and that is as high as virgin birth itself. So it's kind of a mixture of technologies over time. And so what I show is that these things were going on in the ancient Greek world in particular, but really all over the world in
Do you
various
mind
pockets.
sharing what was the first instance that you came across this concept and well, this reality? Because this is like, wow.
Yeah, yeah. Well, two things happened in close proximity, and I'm not entirely sure which one was first, but I remember I was working on my master's degree at the time, and it was a master's thesis on Demeter, the goddesses Demeter and Persephone, the mother-daughter goddesses. And I was reading a book called Meteres, meaning mothers in Italian, by a woman named Anna Maria Corradini, a Sicilian scholar. She was writing about this story of Demeter's conception of Persephone in such a way that it's like a portal opened, a download came in, and I realized, oh my gosh, I think virgin birth was real and that women were doing it. This was like I was in my brother's apartment in Brooklyn, and I'm forgetting now the year, but I think it might have been like 2001. And then right around the same time, I read Drunvalo Melchizedek, this teacher, Drunvalo Melchizedek. He has a 2-volume book called The Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life. And in one of the volumes, he, also being a channeler for the Egyptian god Thoth, you may be familiar, he writes that he says, well, I really don't know what to do with this, but Thoth is telling me that I should write this down, which is that divine conception can actually happen. Mary was involved in it, and a few other things. I would even have to go and look back at the books to see what exactly he said. So put it all together, and I was starting to enter into my Ph.D. program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And I knew already that I wanted to do a doctoral dissertation on ancient priestesses of Greece. In fact, my idea was that I was going to compile every single mention of priestesses in the ancient Greek historical and mythological literature, and I was going to create a catalog. That was going to be my dissertation because I was so fascinated with this concept. Which means what? I'm reclaiming ancient past life knowledge, right? I need to reconstruct this for myself to remember everything and what I need to do in this lifetime, right? And go and move ahead with this mission. Well, because I had this theory rattling around in the back of my mind, whenever I was going to look at this material about priestesses, I started finding evidence for it, that women were giving divine birth in various ways in the ancient myths of Greece, which are basically simply forgotten history, as well as the legends, which are closer in time to us, forgotten history, as well as the bona fide historical documents. I started compiling a mass of evidence in this regard. I mean, it was so astounding and overwhelming and so obvious to me that it was truly unbelievable that in all this time, nobody had written about it before. And I do recall talking to Anne Baring, who wrote with Jules Cashford a book about the goddess. I forget what it was called. It's a real thick book about the goddess. And when I started talking to her about this, she said, maybe I emailed her, she said, you know, I did have an intuition that the ancient stories of the rapes of the maidens by the gods and their impregnations had to do with something that was more like a cult practice. And I was like, yeah. So she was intuiting it. And Dolores Cannon, I think she's written some fictional books that kind of indicate that she was tuned into this whole thing as well. You know, she was a pretty esoteric person. So I was putting all of these research together, doing just tremendous theorizing as I was having to sift through and categorize all this information, and then understand there was a timeline and a chronology and a deterioration of these practices and a hijacking of these practices, and figuring out where did Mother Mary fit into it? Because women were doing it before her, women were doing it after her, you know? And so all the while I was writing that, of course, I was thinking about Mother Mary, and I had planned to do a chapter in my dissertation about divine birth in ancient Greece on Mother Mary, but it was getting so long that I couldn't. So I held it at bay, and I taught a course about it once I created my own Seven Sisters Mystery School, but it was just, you know, kind of a little course. And meanwhile, I knew that I had to do this, and finally the timing seemed right. And I put together all my research on Mother Mary in particular, showed how it related to all this other material from ancient Greece. And that was like the bolster, the foundation, the proof, if you will, the context for understanding Mother Mary's conception in a very different way. And I went from there. And basically, the foundation of this book is the infancy gospel of James, which is one of those apocryphal gospels that the Catholic Church rejected as an official gospel, but it somehow still hung around, and it ended up being the basis of, the details of it ended up being the basis for some of the feast days, like Mary's presentation in the temple and Mary's own birth by her mother Anne, you know, and her own conception by her mother Anne, which this infancy gospel tells us that Mary herself was divinely born by her mother. So because I had done all this research on virgin birth, I knew how to see all the signs, symbols, and codes in this infancy gospel. And that's what I was able to tease out. And, you know, I was teaching about it in those course that I mentioned, but I was really able to flesh it out in this book. And even as I was writing it, I was getting more and more ideas. So it shows us how Mother Mary was born divinely by her mother, how she was raised as an infant, how she was given over to the temple, and how all of this time she was being groomed to become a divine birth priestess. And then the story about what she was doing when she conceived Jesus, I'm able to decipher all of those codes and symbols. And I'm able to explain for thinking people how this virgin birth actually could have happened.
I resonate with a lot of, well, all the stuff that you say, because based on my study, I think it could be the law of one or somewhere else. It talks about when you get into a higher density or higher dimension, the fifth dimension, like you no longer have intercourse and reproductive organs start to shift as you transcend to a higher being. What you shared about Mother Mary and how she came from virgin birth and how Jesus was also from virgin birth as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
What does the Bible say? Does it contradict what the Bible say? And not that I'm holding it as a holy grail, because I believe there's been edited. There's been many different things that I don't, well, not many, but there are certain elements I don't resonate with. I think there's different parts of it used for people's own beneficial purposes.
Yes. Well, the Christian enterprise is based on the idea that Jesus was born of the Virgin. So yes, that's what they hold. Now, but everybody's had to believe that in a kind of like haze of faith, because any of the other details were hidden from us. And in fact, the canonical Christian Bible, the New Testament, says very little about Mother Mary. It just gets the attention right off of her and goes to Jesus. But it relies on the fact of his virgin birth to fuel the idea that he was a supernatural being and that he had all these powers. Because the purpose of divine birth was to give birth to an avatar, a supernatural being, a being that was in those higher dimensions that you were talking about, right? That would catapult the being coming through the earth plane already into that level. even though they would have a human lifetime and human challenges, they were already really at a high vibrational level. So the Bible does say that Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary. She was virginal. She did not have relations with a man, etc. But what it doesn't tell us is what the infancy gospel tells us, which is that Mary was born in the same way by her mother. So this starts telling us that there was a lineage and a family structure and system that was supporting this, because Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, she also gave birth to John the Baptist without having any relations with men. Mm-hmm. And what the Quran tells us is that Elizabeth was Anne's sister, so that this was all a family affair. And if we go back further into the Hebrew tradition, we have Sarah, the biblical mother of Isaac, the wife of Abraham, who divinely conceives Isaac without having relations with Abraham. So there is a lineage in the Hebrew tradition of these women, and that's just, one culture. We get these lineages in other cultures as well. So basically, what I say in this book, in a sense, validates and explains what Christianity has been claiming for 2,000 years, but it puts the power in Mary's lap, whereas traditionally she's just been disappeared from it because it's a threatening concept to patriarchy, the idea that a woman could divinely conceive. We don't want people to pay too much attention to that idea. We don't want them to know the mechanics of it in any way. We don't want them to replicate it, for goodness sake. We just want to use religion to control people. I'm not saying that everyone in Christendom is like that, but there's a big strain that has happened in this regard. So the veil has been pulled over everybody's eyes about the fact that women can use their wombs in miraculous ways, and that there is tremendous female power in that. And if so, what might we do with this going forward in time?
So what would be the main benefits or motivation behind going through a divine birth as opposed to an ordinary birth?
Right. Well, it is possible for people giving birth, conceiving in the usual ways, also to conceive an elevated child. There are mantras and mechanisms, prayers and intentions that can be done. I know of one tradition in India that comes through the ancient palm leaf manuscripts that Sri Kaleshwar, who's a teacher who crossed over in 2012, brought to the attention of the world a decade and a half ago, and that is now being taught. So through intentionality and working with the interdimensional realms and working with the power of the womb, bring forth a higher dimensional being. But for those who really want to bring forth a super duper high dimensional being, that's where virgin birth comes in. And the reason it is done is to help humanity continue to evolve and to raise humanity back up when it has been for a long time under the yoke of negative forces. So periodically, we need a kind of an upgrade from a walking avatar, a walking high dimensional being, to model for us what it is for us to return to our own divine human blueprint, which is actually encoded in our DNA. So these beings will periodically walk the earth to remind us and serve as a model. And then because of all the negativity, their message will get all corrupted and hijacked and taken over. And before you know it, the religion is doing the opposite of what it was supposed to do to begin with, killing people in the name of whatever. So that is the reason to bring forth an avatar. And it takes a very high level of practice on the part of the priestess. She has to be working on this her whole life, and even have come into this lifetime from previous lives where she was working it. And Sri Kaleshwar says that Mother Mary had millions of lifetimes in order to perfect her soul so that she could come in and conceive one in a divine fashion, such as Jesus.
Do you believe that practice of giving divine birth, is that still going on right now, or has it been lost?
I think that it's alive in pieces and pockets, because I do know of a woman who conceived divinely in 1976. Den Poitras writes about her story in his book Parthenogenesis, women's long lost ability to self-conceive. He talks about this woman whom he calls Lori, that's her pseudonym, and how she conceived. She was a high holy woman, a breatharian. She was not schooled in divine birth, but through this grace, she was able to receive this conception, and she did bring a child to term, although it died young. I know of other stories similar of this nature, and I believe and sense there may be other underground stories of how this process is used for both positive and negative conceptions, you see.
Wow.
It can be hijacked. Okay. And I know of women who would like to conceive divinely and are studying what they would need to do, but they have to retrieve it from the Akashic records, the information. You see, there's no teacher that they're consulting. They're consulting guidance on the inner planes and sometimes using my books as stimulant for their knowing.
Yeah, I guess that for me is definitely comprehensible, and it makes it so easy to believe, because for miraculous healing, so many people, so many documents have stated about people miraculous healing from cancer, certain injuries, and blind, and started to be able to see. So for one to manifest or create the situation that they have conceived an embryo is not so far-fetched.
That's right. And you know what, Gary? The lore of the East and Hinduism and Buddhism is filled with siddhic abilities, the siddhi, S-I-D-H-I. These are miraculous abilities that certain people can develop after they have worked with various practices and so forth. And these are all seemingly counter-biological, like being able to walk on water, like being able to walk through walls, like not being able to cast shadows, like being able to live on air and not eat, being able to pull out your entrails and put them back in, being able to change your hair color, different things like that. These are lore. Some of them are documented. There's people today whom I know who have either witnessed or accomplished such things. So there's a lot that's possible. And I think that understanding this is the basis of moving into the new earth, because we do need and want to access our innate abilities for healing, for high-level conceptions and so forth, that are encoded within our very DNA. And we need to retrieve these methods from the Akashic records, from the guides, from the inner guidance, so that we can come fully into our divine human selves, what was called the anthropos, the divine human. And I think that's where those of us who are interested and who are going into the new earth are headed. Whether we will fully accomplish that in this lifetime or not, it's unclear, but we're certainly moving in that direction of being the divinely born walking on the earth.
You mentioned earlier that you covered Mother Mary growing up in the temple. What temple is that?
Well, we don't really know, because, traditional Hebrew scholars and so forth will say, well, there is no such thing as a temple that had virgins. But in fact, it's in the Bible that there were. They were temple virgins, and they were often weavers. It's documented in Kings and various other places. And what do we find out? Mary was weaving when she was conceiving Jesus, so there's some deep, close relationship between temples, virgins, weaving, and sexuality or divine birth, because in the Hebrew Bible, these women, and I think there were also possibly men, were connected to some level of sacred prostitution. So it gets very strange to try to decipher and tease out what was going on. When were they virgins? When were they engaged in this sacred union? So what the infancy gospel tells us, though, is that a number of virgins that are from the temple lead Mary back to the temple when she's 3 years old. They've been training her in her mother's bedroom sanctuary until then. And at that point, gives Mary up to the temple for this mission, for her to be raised properly by these women in all of the aspects of divine birth. And so these virgins take her in, and presumably it is the bona fide Hebrew temple, just something that has been obscured, a phenomenon that has been somewhat obscured in most of the histories, even though, as I said, you can see in the Bible that there's evidence for virgin weavers being in the temples. So
when you say weavers and weaving, like what is that?
well, I think it's a metaphor for what they were doing. I think they were both weaving the temple veil, which was this enormous textile that would be like this wide, and huge. It's reported that it took like 300 men to carry one. Okay, like this enormous textile that would be put at the Holy of Holies to be the door and the barrier in the temple between the regular part of the temple and the Holy of Holies, where all of the sacred implements were, and it was considered basically a portal to the divine.
Oh.
It's where the high priest would go and receive his oracles, his channelers, his channelings, his downloads from the divine. So there was the weaving of this temple and probably other things, maybe even, weaving of clothing of the personnel and so forth. But what I understand and what I tease out in this book is that weaving in Mary's case was a metaphor for the weaving of the DNA that was going on as a part of this divine birth technology. And that's what I talk about in detail.
So something that just popped in my mind, going back to what you said earlier, playing on the words, like Mary is not just a name, it's like priestess and stands for love. When people say they're getting married, marrying someone, does that have any relationship to the word Mary as well?
That's interesting. You'd have to trace the linguistics on that one, which I've never done. The Oxford English Dictionary, I think, tends to have etymological, and there's also an etymological dictionary. So you could look up Mary, Marry, and see what is it related to. Sometimes these are just spurious connections, but sometimes they do lead to something. And even if they don't philologically or whatever the study is, even if scientifically they don't lead to linguistically, back to that root, intuitively we make the connection. And that's really just as important as any sort of root, suffix, prefix, whatever it is,
Yeah.
of any of these words. So that's a wonderful, I love that idea because I'm at a point in my life where I am seeking my marriage-minded soulmate. I have not been formally married. And so I really like that. It's like the word marry or marriage can be kind of like an off-putting thing, even though many people love it and many people want to do it. But, sometimes there's that hesitation. But I like embracing that. I want to be married in a sense of united with a partner. Yes. Because I think that even though she was a virgin, she can support that with people.
Yes, I love that. I guess a final question is, from your work in not just your latest book, but your 2 prior books as well, what do you think the reason that you got called to share this research or to help people remember the truth of what you've discovered?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it was my karmic mission. I think it was, I came in to this lifetime knowing now is the time when the earth veils will be thin enough to be able to have this material come through. I also received in a medicine ceremony that one of the major reasons why I came to talk about and unveil divine birth in this lifetime is because in a previous lifetime, I had been Danae, the mother of Perseus. And what happened was I had been raped by Zeus, who had interfered with my divine birthright, but he seduced me, which is one of the tricks that these gods do, entering into a divine conception ritual. And I succumbed, and I felt so horrified karmically that I had failed in a way, that I had allowed another being to come in, that I gave birth to Perseus, who then cut the head off Medusa, who was another divine birth priestess, that I was so deeply upset about this that I vowed to come in and to make karmic amends by helping people to understand about virgin birth again. So there's one thing, probably part of my Pleiadian mission as well, where I'm connected to those 7 mothers of the world who were virgin mothers, essentially.
Wow. Thank you so much for your generosity of your time. If people want to get the book, what is the best path? Just go on Amazon, go to your website. What's the best path?
Wow, it's sold wherever books are sold. You can go to the Inner Traditions website, innertraditions.com. You can go to barnesandnoble.com, indie.org, and you can go to Amazon, obviously. And one or more of those There is the Audible version as well, the audiobook. And the audiobook is also sold wherever audiobooks are sold. So
Fantastic.
just look up either the title or my name, and you'll find one or both. And the audiobook is a great companion to this because you get to hear me speaking the book out loud, which gives another layer of codes and understandings.
I'll definitely be listening to the audible version. So thank you for all the work that you've done for humanity and for this episode of podcast as well. Much gratitude and love to you. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, Gary. Thank you so much. What a beautiful way to express it. I feel so moved at that, really. So yes, you're welcome. It's my pleasure. And thank you so much.
Thank you.